Welcome to this short screencast on how to use flashcards effectively for revision. So my working context is I'm an A-level sociology teacher, and I use an electronic flashcard system called Brainscape, but what I hope is that the techniques that I'm going to go through in this video are applicable to other subjects and can certainly be used with ordinary flashcards or other types of electronic flashcard systems. So what you can see over here is an electronic flashcard that I've created using Brainscape, and the question that we can see on this side of the flashcard is based on an examination question from the Sociology of Youth Culture. Now the first thing that students have to do is simply to write out this particular question into their notepad, and then they have to engage in some retrieval practice. What I mean by retrieval practice is the act of calling information to mind rather than rereading it or hearing it again. So what the student has to do is they have to try to remember some relevant arguments and evidence that would help them answer this particular question. And then, as we can see with this example over here, what the student is then required to do in their notepad is to briefly summarize these points. And this can be done either through bullet points, as we can see here, or perhaps as a mind map. But it's important that they engage in retrieval practice before turning over to the answer side of the flashcard. Now what you can see over here is the answer side of the flashcard that I prepared for students, and after students have engaged in retrieval practice, the student would then turn over to the answer side and compare what they remembered with the suggested answers on this side of the flashcard. And I ask students to pay particular attention to the names of key sociologists and studies that I've highlighted in bold, as well as the key terms and concepts that are also highlighted in bold type. What the student then does in their notepad, underneath the notes that they made initially through the retrieval practice, is they use the information from the answer side of the flashcard to add to their initial summary. And it's perhaps a good idea for students to do this in a different colour in order to highlight the gaps that exist in their knowledge. Now, one of the problems sometimes with the way in which students use flashcards is they will sometimes memorise the answers without really thinking about the answers and without really analysing or truly understanding the answers. So you can see that what I've added to the bottom of the answer side of the flashcard over here, I've added some elaborative interrogation questions. These are why and how questions that involve the learner looking for explanations for facts and thinking harder about the material that they're trying to learn. And what I get students to do again in their notepad is to try to answer these elaborative interrogation questions in order to develop their analysis of the answers that they're trying to learn. The other thing that students will find at the bottom of the electronic flashcard is a hyperlink. So if the student doesn't understand the answers that they're trying to memorize, what this hyperlink does is it takes them to an online screencast which will reteach the topic that they're still struggling with. And then finally, what the student does in their notepad to complete the exercise is they take one of the bullet points from the answer side of the flashcard and they try to develop that into the type of paragraph that they would write in an actual exam. And wherever possible, one of the things that I encourage students to do when they write their full paragraph is to include a concrete example. And the use of a concrete example helps students to develop their analysis, but it also makes it easier for students to remember the more abstract point that they're trying to learn later on in the future, because often we find it easier initially to remember a concrete example than remembering an abstract theoretical idea. The other thing that students can do with the flashcard app Brainscape is they can self-evaluate how well they knew and understood the answers, and the number of times that the card is then repeated when they go back onto the app is based on how confident they were. In other words, they will get more practice with those cards that for whatever reason are not sticking in their memory. What you can see on this slide is the guidance that I give to students about the tangible evidence that they need to produce in order to show me their use of these electronic flashcards. And it's important, I think, to model the process of doing this before students work independently. This is another example of what the student notepad might look like when they work through their use of the flashcard. So again, they've written the question. This in one colour is what they were able to retrieve from their long-term memory. This in a different colour is additional information from the answer side. Here's their attempt to answering the why and how elaborative interrogation questions, and then they've taken one of the key points and developed it into this full paragraph. And here's a further example, again following the same kind of pattern. Here's the question. As you can see, the student has written down this is what they were able to remember from retrieval practice. Here are the flashcard answers, the elaborative interrogation questions and their answers, and then their paragraph. Now, this way of using flashcards that I've introduced in this video is meant to follow some of the most effective forms of self-study and revision according to research done in the field of cognitive science. So cognitive science suggests that retrieval practice is one of the most important ways and effective ways for students to study. So the evidence is overwhelming that this is much more effective than either rereading and highlighting, even though rereading and highlighting are often strategies that students use more often. It's also important to get students using this system well in advance of the exam. So no cramming, using a form of spaced repetition so that students can distribute their revision over time. Also, when students are using my flashcards, I encourage them each week to mix up the sociological topics that they're learning, because in doing that, that helps them to identify connections between the different parts of the course. I mentioned the elaborative interrogation questions that students find at the bottom of the answer side of the flashcards, these how and why questions that I mentioned earlier. And also, I've already mentioned the importance of students including concrete examples when they're writing their final paragraph. So students will find it easier to recall abstract ideas if they can relate those concepts and theories to concrete examples. If you're interested in finding out more about the cognitive science behind these strategies, I've made another video called Make It Stick that goes into more detail about the research. And finally, I think the most useful thing that I found online for both students and teachers thinking about evidence-informed approaches to revision and self-study is the Learning Scientists website, which is learningscientists.org, and there are lots of really useful resources on this website, including downloadable posters and also videos that help to explain the research behind cognitive science.